Hey guys, tonight we sneak into Versailles, the magnificent gilded cage where the 5-year-old Prince Louis the 15th ascended the throne as France's beacon of hope. But 60 years later, he died rotting, flesh melting away from smallpox, while Parisians were partying wildly outside. This is how the well-beloved king turned into the well-rotten king debt-riddled wars, overreaching mistresses, and a throne steeped in decay. Think you can handle that stench? Spoiler, you can't. So before you get comfortable, hit like and subscribe, but only if you truly enjoy my content. Drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is for you. Now, dim the lights. Turn on a fan for that gentle hum. And let's dive into tonight's journey. Within the opulent corridors of Versailles, once dazzling with gold leaf and royal pomp, now hangs a stench of rot and betrayal. In the year 1774, the so-called well-beloved King Louis the 15th met his end in absolute calamity. His body not only ravaged by smallpox, but also corroded by the very throne he occupied. His pus-filled, decaying flesh stood as a grotesque monument to a dynasty that had feasted upon its own excess. Silence regned, save for the mournful sigh of draughts slipping through endless galleries and the occasional sympathetic creak of a candle's dying flame. Louis's fall from grace started back in 1715, when a mere 5-year-old boy was saddled with the crown of his illustrious great-grandfather, Louis the 14th, the Sun King whose 72-year reign gleamed with splendor yet bankrupted France. Orphaned almost at birth and reared under Philippe II, Duke of Orleans, young Louis soaked up lessons in Latin, mathematics, philosophy, and court etiquette with the dutiful attention of a child who had no choice but to grow up fast. Each morning, he awoke to pale sunlight spilling through lofty windows and the hushed lectures of tutors who treated him like a miniature CEO. The French greeted their boy king with podium-shaking cheers, eager for relief from crushing war debts and endless bloodshed. By 1723, he'd assumed full authority and, by all accounts, looked every bit the part, polite to the Pope, diplomatic with foreign courts, and charming enough to earn the nickname Le Bien-Aimé. His subjects pinned their hopes on him, convinced a fresh breeze of enlightenment would sweep away the grime of past conflicts. Beneath those gilded arches, Louis did deliver tax cuts for peasants, grand commissions for scientists and artists, and public audiences where applause thundered like cannon fire. Yet beyond the velvet ropes, the same old power brokers plotted and connived, turning Versailles into a glittering stage for backroom scheming. The palace's sadness seeped into its marble veins, proof that even a nation's fondest dreams can collapse under the weight of inexperience. Now, as an autumn gust rattles the draperies, Versailles seems to shudder with the memory of Louis's slow decline. The once bright child monarch, enthroned on luxury, has given way to a hollow shell, an aging sovereign whose trembling voice whispered futile apologies for ambitions he could not fulfill. In that heavy stillness, we're reminded that brilliance and devotion, no matter how fervent, are powerless against the relentless march of time and the unforgiving hunger of power. In the first act of his reign, Louis the 15th stole the spotlight by marrying Marie Leszczyńska, that elegant Polish princess everyone gushed over. Their wedding was less a ceremony and more a blockbuster extravaganza, complete with adorable royal offspring, tiny princes and princesses blooming like overwatered daisies. The Franco-Polish alliance wasn't just about peace. It was a diplomatic power play that fattened France's credit lines and turned Paris into the belle of the European ball. Under Louis's watch, Paris remained. The continent's cultural hotspot academies bloomed. Salons buzzed with philosophers and inventors, and Versailles hummed with the latest avant-garde experiments. He fancied himself a modernizer, snatching up Enlightenment, bigwigs like Voltaire and Montesquieu, and underwriting everything from stargazing to anatomy dissections. Creativity crackled through those gilt-edged halls. promising an age of reason, or at least a very entertaining court. Parisians, from powdered wig nobles to bespectacled merchants, puffed out their chests, certain that their young king would deliver France into a new era of brilliance. But behind the velvet curtains, the cracks were already spider-webbing across the court's facade. After a few too many days spent entertaining themselves with state affairs, Louis swapped serious governance for personal indulgence. He leaned not on his seasoned ministers, but on a tight circle of favourites, and a certain Madame de Pompadour, whose influence extended from boudoir banter straight into the cabinet. These mistresses weren't mere arm candy. They handed out court appointments and whispered foreign policy tips into the king's ear. Soon, Versailles morphed into a playground of debauchery ornate feasts where the wine flowed like a river and dancers sashayed beneath flickering candelabras. The palace became known as the theatre of hedonism, where responsibility took a holiday. Laughter and soft candlelight hid the acrid tang of tobacco, and the sweet burn of vintage claret masking the cries of citizens buried under crushing taxes. While trumpet fanfares blared inside, the common folk outside groaned under mounting debt. The first major wake-up call was the War of the Austrian Succession, 1740 to 1748. France, eager to flex its muscles and support its Habsburg pact, squared off against Britain and Prussia. Despite boasting impressive legions, the French army ended up doing more retreating than conquering. War costs skyrocketed, supply dwindled, and the treasury shriveled until ministers had no choice but to slap heavier taxes on already broke taxpayers. People seethed, from Parisian taverns to country hamlets. They shook their heads at piles of enemy corpses, lining the roads, and shivered at tales of botched withdrawals. Louis the 15th had once tried to rally the troops in person, earning a brief boost in street cred. But strategic blunders quickly surfaced terrible battle plans, delayed reinforcements, and that pesky habit of believing overly rosy reports from his inner circle. When the war finally ended, with a treaty that gave France almost nothing, returning nearly every captured province, the nation's blood and money felt utterly wasted. Citizens griped that their sacrifices had bankrolled a half-baked victory. Even worse, instead of fixing their mistakes, the court dove headlong back into luxury and intrigues. Versailles stayed as opulent as ever, but debt and popular resentment dulled the shine that once hailed Louis the 15th's rise. On one crisp, dew-draped morning, when the domes glittered and the breeze danced with the draperies, Versailles seemed to sigh in quiet heartbreak. The faith once lavished on the well-beloved king lay in ruins, replaced by the soft echo of gilded walls that mourned a monarch too young to shoulder his crown and too enamoured of pleasure to realize its weight. In that hushed moment, it became clear even the grandest triumphs can collapse under the intoxicating spell of unchecked power. When the Treaty of Aix-la-Chapelle finally called time on the War of the Austrian Succession, the French felt like they'd been roasted alive. Tons of blood spilled, taxes skyrocketing only to hand everything back to the enemy on a silver platter. All for nothing became the rallying cry from rural cottages to the swankiest Parisian cafes. Rage against the so-called well-beloved king boiled over. Instead of facing his hungry, overtaxed subjects, Louis the 15th vanished into Versailles, resurfacing only for decadent balls. He cloistered himself with a handful of yes-men, like a snail hiding in its shell, deaf to the screams for relief, echoing beyond the palace gates. Then came the 7 Years' War. From 1756 to 1763, a cataclysm that knocked France off its perch. The French flag, once proud, drooped disgracefully across North American battlefields. Canada and Louisiana, those glittering crown jewels, tumbled into British hands like overripe fruit falling from a dying branch. Defeat was twofold military humiliation and a morale-crushing blow to national pride. Taxes, already dead weight, soared further. The poor couldn't afford a single bowl of rice, while nobles and clergy lounged tax-exempt. Small protests in the suburbs sparked street-wide revolts. France, once top dog, was demoted to also ran, and faith in the monarchy hit rock bottom. Military defeat bled straight into a financial collapse. The treasury went bone dry, like a pond after a heat wave. Louis the 15th, brave enough in battle but utterly spineless in finance, shrunk from tax reform under pressure from powerful cliques. Finance ministers such as Etienne de Silhouette, Maupeou, and Necker arrived full of pep but crashed under ruthless resistance. Every new tax announcement set off a chorus of angry shouts in the markets that even official trumpets couldn't drown out. The unfair tax system became a ticking time bomb, its fuse lit by smouldering public fury. Daily life for ordinary folk turned into an unending nightmare. Champagne farmers sold every last grape to satisfy tax collectors. Parisian artisans worked themselves ragged just to buy a loaf of bread. Meanwhile, the court splurged on palace renovations, extravagant feasts, guest philosophers, and costume contests worthy of a circus, gazing at the banner-draped halls alive with music. People muttered, "When will they ditch the pageantry and feed the hungry?" It wasn't mere whining, it was a warning flare for a regime about to implode. Under Versailles' gilded dome, applause for the king died out. Instead, resentful glances and hushed fears filled the air. Ladies in waiting, senior courtiers, and royal scribes exchanged worried looks, wondering if a pleasure-addicted monarch could possibly steer the state through a storm. The answer was written in the arid ledgers of debt, and the anguished cries echoing from beyond the palace walls, staring into this shattered mirror of absolute rule. One truth shone clear splendor, and power can't last without responsibility and the guts to reform. Louis the 15th's heir, even with the best intentions, would inherit a kingdom teetering on the edge of revolt. And in that hushed moment, as Versailles' gates swung shut, only the faint echo of future footsteps remained, heralding an upheaval that could no longer be ignored. Caught in the whirlpool of bankruptcy and public fury, Louis the 15th dove headfirst into his personal playground of mistresses treating France's fate as side entertainment to his love life. First on stage was Madame de Pompadour, the sharp-tongued ingenue whose salon chatter carried as much weight as any council memo. She handed out court offices like candy, her nod deciding promotions more than dusty old decrees. When her glittering influence waned, Madame du Barry sashayed into power, equally eager to swap backstage whispers for real cabinet seats. Neither woman was content playing arm candy. They grabbed the reins of policy, distributing titles and ambassadorships as if they were fashionable trinkets, qualifications optional. This spectacle enraged both aristocrats and commoners. Battle-hardened generals found themselves sidelined in favor of sycophants, whose only credential was a pretty smile. Lifetime bureaucrats, those who'd memorized every tax code and treaty, watched in stunned silence as singers and dancers waltzed into positions of authority. Murmurs of disbelief echoed through Versailles' marble halls. Is this how you run a nation? By handing out jobs like party favors. The divine right of kings began to sound more like a VIP pass to a private amusement park, where beauty and flirtation trumped loyalty and expertise. Even the church, once a bulwark of royal legitimacy, offered no safe harbor. In 1764, Louis the 15th booted the Jesuits out of France, an action cheered by those tired of their meddling but condemned by devout Catholics who saw Jesuit schools as spiritual backbone. The king's censorship of any anti-monarchy tracts only turned dissent into a secret thrill ride. Banned pamphlets and smuggled essays by Voltaire and Rousseau spread like wildfire in Parisian coffeehouses, lighting up hearts, hungry for reform and jolting the Enlightenment underground into overdrive. Meanwhile, the economy keeled over. Public debt ballooned until interest alone swallowed a quarter of royal income. Provincial farmers sold their seed grain to pay taxes, dooming next year's harvest, while artisans in Lyon and Rouen watched orders vanish as nobles stocked Versailles' ever-growing appetite for feasts and fireworks. The nobles and clergy, of course, sat out the tax madness in cushy exemption. leaving peasants and the rising middle class to bear the full brunt. A Rouen baker might fork over 10 times the levy of a Paris duke, and a lion silk weaver found herself choosing between feeding her children and bribing local officials. Food shortages became the agony underscore to this national meltdown. Failed harvests sent crowds storming grain depots in Toulouse, Bordeaux, and countless market squares, pitchforks turning into makeshift protest banners. Soldiers broke up bread riots with bayonets, but every clash only fanned the flames of revolt. At Versailles, these uprisings were seen as minor nuisances, brief comedic relief before the next masked ball. Guards slammed palace gates to hide starving faces, while courtiers whispered about the latest gown designs to distract from the gnawing hunger outside. The magic of the monarchy evaporated. Once the anointed protector of France, the king now appeared a distant bon vivant, more at home amid glittering soirees than grappling with a crumbling state. His sacred aura slipped through his fingers like gold dust, leaving behind whispered cynicism instead of awed veneration. Under Versailles' lofty arches, courtiers fidgeted, unsure whether to applaud the king's entrance or make a discreet exit. In that half-lit world of velvet drapes and ticking clocks, the heart of France stirred with restless discontent. Memories of benevolent reforms and artistic patronage felt like fairy tales from another age. In their place lay the stark reality of hunger, injustice, and a court so out of touch it seemed from another planet. As autumn winds rattled palace window panes and carried the faint groans of the starving inside, one truth rang clear: a throne upheld by privilege and vice cannot endure when its people starve and rage. The seeds of revolution had sprouted. No amount of powder puffs or flattery could ever uproot them. At long last, the royal court had transformed into the living embodiment of excess gilded carriages parading down the avenues of Versailles, while the common folk huddled under tattered cloaks, stomachs growling in protest. The king's retinue shimmered with diamonds so large they could blind a peasant at 50 paces, while silks and ermine cloaks swirled like some absurd peacock pageant. In a final, audacious power play, the crown stripped the Parliament of Paris of its historic authority and installed obedient courts packed with hand-picked lackeys. This bold grab for control cemented the slide into pure autocracy, sealing Louis the Fifteenth in an ever-deepening bubble of privilege. Those hopeful days when a humble petition for tax relief might reach a sympathetic ear were gone. The king, ensconced in Versailles, had no time for real-world grievances. Meanwhile, the whispers of scandal morphed into a full-throated roar of outrage. At the drowsy Petit Trianon retreat, Louis the Fifteenth lavished his attention and the royal coffers on a revolving cast of mistresses. First, Madame de Pompadour, then Madame du Barry. Each received chests overflowing with jewels, silk undress gowns, and private feasts featuring exotic fruits flown in at great expense. Outside the palace walls, men, women, and children scrounged for scraps. Inside, the courtiers gossiped over pearls and pâté. Every diamond necklace and velvet robe became a pointed reminder that the king's priorities lay far from breadbaskets and barns, stoking a public fury that crackled in every tavern and village green. In stark contrast to this orgy of luxury, the pens of Enlightenment philosophers moved with electric urgency. Voltaire's biting satires carved into the heart of privilege like a surgeon's scalpel, exposing hypocrisy with merciless wit. Rousseau's meditations on natural liberty and the social contract spread clandestinely among lawyers, shopkeepers, and even some disgruntled nobles. Their pamphlets and essays were passed hand to hand in hushed gatherings, planting seeds of reform in soils long fertilized by loyalty to divine monarchy. Ach, clandestines allons. Each whispered reading at dusk gnawed away at the myth of the king's infallibility, recasting allegiance not as blind devotion, but as a pact of mutual respect. By the time these intellectual currents swelled into full-blown popular movements, France was already reeling from old wounds. The populace still bore scars from decades of war, ghostly memories of retreating armies, shattered villages, and the weight of crippling taxes, no court favourite's trinket or mistress's silken scarf could soothe memories of bread riots and shuttered shops. When calls for justice and fair governance finally crescendoed into collective demand, the court was too hollowed out by greed and nepotism to respond. The vaulted halls of Versailles, once echoing with triumphant fanfares, now rang hollow under the burden of neglect. Masked balls went on, but the laughter sounded brittle, like porcelain teacups cracking. Music drifted like a distant mirage, a cruel echo amid a kingdom gasping for air. The spectacle of Versailles in all its ostentation came to symbolize the state's last desperate gasp. Gilded mirrors and crystal chandeliers no longer reflected majesty, but decay, trapping the courtiers in a golden cage of their own reckless design. The chasm between palace and people yawned ever wider. To the commoner, Versailles became a fairy tale turned nightmare, a palace that dazzled by moonlight, yet whose foundations crumbled under the weight of hunger and injustice. By dawn, even the most cheerful diversion, a new mask, a fresh set of ivory combs, could not mask the growing sense that the whole edifice was on the brink of collapse. And so the stage was set for the monarchy's final tragedy. The extravagant ceremonies and sumptuous buffets, meant to dazzle the realm, instead lit the fuse of revolution. The king's isolation, his blatant favoritism, and the unstoppable force of enlightenment thought all coalesced into a movement that the crown could neither contain nor placate. This was no spontaneous uprising of the destitute alone, but a tide of anger rising from every corner of society, merchants squeezed by tariffs, peasants crushed by tithes, and even some nobles appalled at the crown's cronyism. In the cruelest irony, the very grandeur that was supposed to immortalize Louis the Fifteenth and his heirs highlighted their ultimate failure. The shimmering silks, polished marble floors, and silver candelabra, all those tokens of a regal dream, became relics of a past that could never be reclaimed. When the first sparks of rebellion finally flickered in the narrow streets of Paris, Versailles stood as both a monument and a warning, privilege unbridled, power unchecked, and compassion utterly squandered. The curtain was about to rise on a new drama, one scripted by a people done with silence, determined to reclaim their own story. In the sleepy dawn of the 1770s, France lay groaning under an avalanche of debt so massive that the treasury looked ready to implode. One would-be saviour after another strutted through the palace gates only to stumble back out in disgrace. First up was Etienne de Silhouette, whose bold tax plan was designed to clip the wings of the rich, but instead clipped his own career when nobles and clergy united in a hissy fit and had him sacked. Then came Maupeou, who tried to neuter the Parliament of Paris, quickly realizing that chopping down one institution only grows 10 more in its place. Finally, Jacques Necker arrived, bearing promises of foreign loans and ledger-clutching reforms, only to find himself batted away by the same gang of tax-exempt grandees. Throughout it all, the privileged classes, nobles in their ermine cloaks and clerics in their plush robes, languished in exemption, while every attempt to spread the tax burden met a brick wall of aristocratic outrage, leaving the true root of the crisis festering like a wound in need of stitches. As the budget crisis boiled over, social unrest bubbled into full-blown riots. Food prices rocketed to lunar heights, and back-to-back crop failures turned once fertile fields into dust bowls. Hunger ceased to be polite. It became a siren call to revolt. Peasants stormed grain depots, hurling sacks of wheat onto carts, bound for London. They tarred and feathered detested tax collectors, torched manor houses, and chased estate managers through muddy paddocks. In the cities, marauding mobs snatched bread from bakeries, yanked officials from their carriages, and unceremoniously dumped them into gutters. The Crown's answer: deploy troops and draconian police forces, who fired warning shots into the air, hauled people off without trial, and marched through cities like jackbooted party crashers. Each crackdown only stoked the embers of resentment, driving more of the hungry and desperate into the streets. And then, amid the din of protest and the crackle of musket fire, a new sound emerged, the click of printing presses turning out clandestine newspapers and pirated pamphlets. Like mushrooms after a rainstorm, journals and philosophical reviews sprouted, championing human rights, popular sovereignty, and the radical notion that power should be checked and balanced, not festooned with velvet and diamonds. Terms once whispered in dusty lecture halls: freedom of expression, separation of powers, equality before the law, exploded into coffeehouse conversations and salon debates. Voltaire's cutting wit, Rousseau's feverish call for social contract, and Diderot's encyclopedic dream were passed hand to hand, infiltrating every class, from ambitious merchants to curious farmhands, even some junior nobles, their pockets lighter than their ancestors, felt the infectious itch for reform and dared to question the divine right of kings. Meanwhile, the classic trinity of power: king, church, and nobility revealed itself to be more brittle than gold leaf. The crown flirted with modest reforms but cowered when the grandee lobby snarled. The church, guardian of souls, clamped down on dissent, but shrugged at starvation. And the aristocracy, ever obsessed with privilege, vilified reformists as rabble-rousers while sipping champagne in silken waistcoats. Louis the 15th himself had retreated into his Versailles cocoon and Petite Trianon hunting lodge, lording over lavish fetes and game shoots, rather than listening to grumbling subjects. Petitions for relief and gallant schemes for fiscal salvation were dismissed, as so much background noise, mere prelude to the next masked ball. That deafness to suffering laid the warp and weft for an unavoidable revolution. As despair turned to determination, the only remaining path would be one of upheaval, not polite protests. In those hushed corridors of Versailles, where lanterns flickered and palace pages tumbled bleary-eyed from one wing to the next, the air held not hope, but the pregnant pause before a storm. The walls themselves seemed to tremble under the weight of urgency, as if the very marble could sense the rumble of an angry populace. By the time the first chants of liberty crackled through Parisian alleys, Versailles stood as both monument and warning, a gilded folly of unchecked privilege and hollow power. The sumptuous banquets, the glittering carriages, the library of forbidden texts, all had served to highlight the monarchy's decay. Beyond those opulent gates, a new France awakened, one that would no longer bow to divine right or courtly obscurity. It would demand rights, representation, and reckoning for decades of neglect. So here, in the twilight of absolute monarchy, the stage was set. The pomp of Versailles would soon be drowned out by the clamorous roar of the people, and when that first spark of revolt touched the tinderbox of injustice, it would set ablaze not only the ancient regime, but also the old expectations of power and privilege. France stood on the cusp of a transformation so vast that no powder of reconciliation or whisper of flattery could stop it. The revolution, once seeded in the soil of despair and watered by tears and rage, was inevitable, and it was nearly here. By the early 1770s, enlightenment, ideas, liberty, equality, fraternity had erupted across France like a surprise fireworks show, captivating not just bespectacled philosophers but bakers, shopkeepers, and even some scowling minor nobles. Voltaire's scathing jabs at superstition, Montesquieu's schematics for checks and balances, and Rousseau's glowing manifesto on the social contract raced from hand to hand in bustling Paris cafes. As eagerly traded as the finest macarons, these subversive bestsellers then drifted out to the countryside, unbound pamphlets read aloud in village squares where peasants and local merchants, eyes alight, soaked in promises of transparent budgets, open debates, and a fair slice of the national debt pie. Concepts once locked in dusty university tomes: power derives from the people, Governments must answer to their citizens, shed their academic dryness, and became incendiary calls to action. Meanwhile, back in the guilt-encrusted cage that was Versailles, Louis the Fifteenth and his glittering court treated national upheaval like background noise at an endless gala. The palace became the Titanic's last waltz, an over-the-top spectacle of silks and areas blasting full tilt just as the shipper kingdom steered straight toward disaster. At the heart of every whispered intrigue was Madame du Barry, court superstar and unofficial prime minister of pleasure, handing out sinecures as if they were candy at Mardi Gras. Her salon reign eclipsed any official ministry. Why consult a policy expert when you could chat with a mistress whose favour guaranteed promotion out beyond those mirrored walls? Hardship was hard to ignore. One tavern goer spat. They banquet on our nickels while we scrape crumbs off barn floors. Patrons at rural inns fumed as vaulted ceilings and crystal goblets flaunted the very wealth that starved their children. That simmering fury found its megaphone in the burgeoning opposition press. Investigative scribes tore into every royal expense with gleeful, relish-wagging fingers at couture gowns for opera divas, tallying the diamonds showered on mistresses, and cataloguing the tax breaks doled out like party invitations. Each exposé coiled tighter around the monarchy's neck. The debate spilled out of plush salons and onto dusty village lanes, into schoolrooms and even parish pulpits. Patriotic war veterans, impassioned university students, and long-suffering merchants took to the streets under banners, proclaiming fair taxation, rule of law, and unshackled speech. In Bunnet, the court slammed the lid on. Dissent presses were seized, pamphleteers thrown into dungeons, and simple chalked slogans on church walls met with draconian trials. But censorship backfired spectacularly. Every banned essay became a coveted prize, each arrest a rallying cry. Slowly, the illusion of divine right grandeur cracked. Tales of sacred kingship rang hollow against empty bread bins and ever-rising interest tab. Louis the 15th, once hailed as a reformer, now found himself buffeted by forces he'd ignored for too long. His pitiful half-measures and preference-driven handouts couldn't reclaim trust, eroded by years of kleptocratic revelry, and so the pillars of absolute monarchy groaned under the weight of collective outrage. Reverence gave way to resolve these people would no longer serve as mere ATM machines for royal banquets. Whispers of reform had mutated into a chorus demanding revolution. By the time autumn leaves carpeted the palace grounds, the drama was set. The Enlightenment's clarion call had yanked France from its lullaby of lavish balls and idle privilege. Louis the 15th, safe in his velvet armchairs, might have felt a tremor, but the ground beneath him was already slipping toward a new France, powered by reason, equality, and an uncompromising public will. In that fading twilight, one truth pierced the hush. Ignore your people, and you're simply building the pyre on which your throne will burn. In the spring of 1774, Louis the 15th's personal Armageddon hit like a wrecking ball. On the 28th of April, he woke up feeling hotter than a forge, his head pounding like a drunken drummer, and then erupted in smallpox pustules so cartoonishly grotesque that even mirrors recoiled. Versailles, that palace of polished vanity, instantly turned into a madhouse. Courtiers bolted for the exits as if the Red Sea had parted for them. Guards refused to draw swords for a king who now looked like a walking contagion, and the physicians armed only with rusty lancets and dubious herbal concoctions were about as useful as chocolate teapots. Overnight, the glittering corridors stank of rot and panic, a cross between a field hospital and a charnel house. Louis's battle for survival became a ghastly spectacle, renowned for his vanity. He now whimpered for mercy, pleading forgiveness from both God and his famished subjects. Yet mercy, it turned out, was in short supply. Each time his voice cracked a confession, his flesh betrayed him. Pustules burst, spewing streams of foul-smelling pus that made every royal decree about dignity sound like a bad joke. All those ornate court rituals, those sanitized portraits and stiff collars gone, swept aside by the primal horror of decay. At last, on the 10th of May, 1774, after nearly a fortnight of excruciating agony, Louis the 15th finally succumbed. His death throes were so violent that even the most stout-hearted royal guards bolted, abandoning their posts. There, in the candlelit chamber, lay a monarch once adored as le bien-aimé, now reduced to trembling flesh and bone before the indifferent cruelty of smallpox. France's reaction was swift and mercilessly joyful. No tearful state funerals, no tolling bells. Instead, from Parisian boulevards to Provençal lanes, the news sparked impromptu street parties. Commoners danced with wild relief, hoisting each other on their shoulders and firing celebratory gun salutes, an irreverent replacement for funeral bells. Church bells, silent in solidarity, only deepened the sense that the nation had finally exhaled. At last, this rotten reign is dead. Versailles itself couldn't muster a proper funeral. The king's corpse was so ravaged that embalmers, their noses pressed to handkerchiefs, refused to linger. Public health fears trumped protocol, and in a panicked flurry, his remains were sealed in a lead coffin and whisked off to the Basilica of Saint Denis. The grand procession, meant to inspire solemnity, instead felt like a gloved, shivering march of nobles too relieved to bear witness. Their sombre faces were etched, not with mourning, but with the faintest trace of grudging satisfaction. To the people of France, Louis the Fifteenth's corpse was the ultimate emblem of a monarchy that had fed upon their taxes and goodwill, until every barrel of grain and every ounce of hope was sucked dry. Their relief was not born of cruelty, but of exhausted frustration. The crown had proven itself a parasite, draining the nation down to its marrow, even in death. Louis's legacy served as a macabre lesson, tales of his final agonies, corridors echoing with frantic whispers, church bells that refused to toll, and roars of liberty from the gutters became the stuff of legend. Whispered from market stalls to smoky taverns, they spoke of a lingering stench, as if the rotting sovereign had left behind an invisible cloud of corruption that clung stubbornly to palace walls long after his coffin disappeared. Thus, in that fevered spring, an era of unparalleled decadence drew to a close. The collapse of Louis the 15th was no mere royal footnote. It was a vivid demonstration of privilege's ultimate futility. When the king who promised renewal died in disgrace, the French people glimpsed their own power, revolution, long simmering in secret salons and pamphlets, found fresh vigour in the mocking revelry that greeted the end of Le Bien-Aimé. As the crackle of gunfire celebrations faded into the May night, one undeniable truth rose from the carnage: no crown, however gleaming, can withstand the withering verdict of history. And no king, however beloved, escapes the fate of rot when he neglects his people. By the time Louis the 15th gasped his last convulsive breath, the monarchy's demise had moved from whispered rumour to full-blown spectacle. His funeral preparations were the coup de grace that no one wanted to applaud. His body, ravaged by smallpox, stank so ferociously that even veteran embalmers gagged and refused to touch it. In panic befitting a tragicomedy, the court sealed him in a lead coffin and hustled it off to Saint-Denis. No viewing, no grand procession, and certainly no golden hearse. The cortege rattled through the palace gates like a plague cart, stripped of crown, stripped of ceremony, and stripped of any pretense of respect. Street-side spectators treated the passing coach not as a solemn ritual, but as free entertainment. They craned their necks at that lugubrious train of black wheels and lead coffin, more eager for a peek than a prayer. Some heckled with mock cheers, others lobbed pebbles at the wooden box as though baptizing it with scorn. The nobles, scandalized by the affront to dignity, scuttled away down side alleys. Meanwhile, the long-oppressed commoners, beat down by taxes, hunger, and broken promises, felt a surge of newfound liberty. The royal family's casual indifference to their king's grotesque death sounded like a declaration of war. The time for blind obedience was over. Yet, as the coffin creaked its way through foggy woods to the basilica, another march was already in full swing. Across villages and market towns, people rallied for an Estates General, an assembly where clergy, nobility, and the third estate of commoners would have equal say. Opposition clubs sprouted in town squares, led by disgruntled attorneys, merchants squeezed dry by oppressive levies, and even some junior nobles torn between personal gain and principle. They railed against tax injustice, demanded open books on royal spending, and insisted on the right to draft laws that governed their lives. Inside hearth-warmed inns, farmers cursed tithes that starved their families, while up the road, wealthy blacksmiths seethed over tariffs that gnawed at their profits. Each complaint echoed the last, weaving a web of resentment, stretching from Brittany's wind-swept cliffs to Provence's sun-drenched vineyards, no longer content with hushed whispers in oak-panelled salons. These groups took to the streets, waving banners, proclaiming no taxation without participation and let us speak, or let us die. The rallying cry for the Estates General, a body last convened under Louis the Fifteenth, quickly became the movement's anthem. They argued that only a representative assembly could heal the kingdom's wound, demanding transparent budgets, curbing unchecked royal power, and enshrining every community's right to shape the laws that shaped their lives. These weren't lofty abstractions, they were survival manuals, penned in ink, and delivered to every seigneur's doorstep. Momentum built like a runaway carriage. Provincial judges balked at delivering new tax edicts, their quills trembling at the sight of angry petitioners. Even some clerics, long mute, quietly cheered the call for a general assembly, acknowledging that a system already groaning under financial ruin and moral decay could not survive another collapse. Back at Versailles, the young Louis the 16th, barely 20, fidgeted in his gilt-armoured courts. Factions squabbled over whether to grant the demand or delay it with yet another royal decree. Meanwhile, Parisian café buzzed with fresh pamphlet, and provincial gazettes boasted yet another county unanimously calling for Estates General. When the lead coffin finally rattled into Saint-Denis, the monarchy's real burial was already underway. The interment of unchallenged royal authority, the dull clang of hammers sealing the lid, was drowned out by the roar of collective determination. What dignity remained lay 6 feet underground, alongside a king reduced to rot above ground. The living kingdom braced for the reckoning it had long deferred. Thus, in those waning days of spring, an age-old dynasty met its end, not by blade or bullet, but by the unstoppable will of a people discovering their own voice. The ancient bonds of fear and fealty snapped, replaced by stacks of petitions, stacks of pamphlets, and the thunder of boots on cobblestones. As dusk fell on the sealed tomb of Louis the 15th, one truth shone clear. The real funeral bell for absolute monarchy had already tolled. The stage was set for the Estates General to convene, heralding either the last act of royal absolutism or the opening chapter of revolutionary France. Louis the 16th inherited the throne like a man parachuting into a burning building. The royal coffers were as empty as a beggar's bowl. Public debt bulged past reason, and French society lay in tatters, splintered by privilege on one side and grinding poverty on the other. Young Louis, with his innocent smile and reformist dreams, might as well have tried to bail out the Atlantic with a thimble. The old guard, those pampered nobles in powdered wigs and cushioned clerics, slammed the door on every attempt at fair taxation or sensible spending. Meanwhile, the common folk, fatigued by endless levies and gnawing hunger, took to jeering in taverns, calling their new king another link in a rusted chain of incompetence. Beneath the glittering tyranny of Versailles, Enlightenment ideas brewed like a potent ale. underground newspapers, brazen pamphlets, and fervent lectures poured fuel on the smouldering discontent. Voltaire's scorn for superstition and Rousseau's blueprint for social equality escaped plush Parisian salons to infect market stalls and countryside inns. Students in town squares and farmers in distant hamlets found common cause. They clamoured for an Estates General, a nationwide convention where clergy, nobility, and the third estate of ordinary citizens would sit together and hammer out laws on taxes, budgets, and sweeping reforms. Faced with this tidal wave of public wrath, and perhaps still haunted by the grotesque demise of his grandfather, Louis the 15th, Louis the 16th could no more resist than a guillotine blade could halt its descent. In the spring of 1789, he issued the long-promised writ summoning the Estates General, the very body last convened under Louis the 14th. This single act sparked the fuse that would immolate the ancient regime and illuminate the path to revolution. Throughout these fraught months, the tragic tale of Louis the 15th loomed large, a horror story for the ages. His arc from celebrated youth, dubbed le bien-aimé, to a despised, rotting cadaver, became the perfect allegory for despotism's rot. Pustules, panic-stricken courtiers, and cheers of relief at his death stripped away monarchy's vaunted mystique, exposing the raw, repulsive truth that unchecked power inevitably decays. By agreeing to convene the Estates General, Louis the 16th unwittingly beckoned the very forces that would sweep him aside. The spectre of his grandfather's decaying reign had already shattered the illusions of royal invincibility and divine sanction. Now armed with the rallying cries of the Enlightenment, liberty, equality, fraternity, the people prepared to seize their destiny. No longer would they endure princes cocooned in velvet while families starved. No longer would they genuflect before rapacious tax collectors or submit to petitions that vanished in palace drawers. The moribund alliance of privilege and inertia had exhausted its welcome. The nation thirsted for a government born of consent, transparency, and accountability. As the Estates General's opening day dawned in Versailles' gilded hall, the shadows of past failures clung to every gold-gilded cornice and mirrored pane. The grotesque finale of Louis the 15th's reign cast a spectre over the assembly, yet it was precisely that dreadful image, his reluctant confession of mortality and moral bankruptcy, that laid fertile ground for revolution. The macabre demise of a once-cherished king became the prologue to a republic, forged by a people determined never again to let rulers feast on their suffering. By the end, Bourbon absolutism lay in ruins, its pillars of fear and blind obedience crumbled by reason, empathy, and the relentless voice of the masses. The Estates General of 1789 was not merely a legislative session, it was the crucible of modern democracy, tempered by the memory of a king's ignominious end, and driven by a unified demand for justice that would echo through the centuries. As the freshly minted National Assembly gathered, one truth resonated louder than any royal decree: power that refuses to bend to the will of its people will inevitably break beneath the weight of its own hubris. By the time old Louis the 15th finally keeled over and was whisked away in a lead coffin sealed tighter than a bootlegger's barrel, France's financial Titanic was still hurtling headlong into the abyss. The royal treasury, emptied by endless wars and aristocratic blowouts, was bone dry. Public debt had ballooned so wildly that foreign banks refused to gamble on French IOUs. Enter Louis the 16th. Inheriting this fiscal dumpster fire like a bad penny, he promptly appointed reform-minded ministers, first Turgot, then Necker, who swaggered in with confident quills, only to have their sensible tax plans kneecapped by a Senate full of tax-exempt nobles and clerics. Every clever proposal to tax land or church property died on paper, choked by entrenched privilege. Meanwhile, the common folk sank deeper into the mire. In Champagne, tenant farmers hawked half-ripe grain at giveaway prices just to stave off creditors. In Paris, a single loaf of bread soared past reason, forcing families to sell heirlooms and, heart-wrenchingly, even their children to fill empty stomachs. Beggars multiplied on every corner, and petty theft became a survival sport. Then came the Great Bread Crisis of 1788 to 1789. Mobs laid siege to bakeries, howling for free bread, and skirmished violently with the king's guards. Muskets cracked like tragic jokes overhead, and the monarchy's vaunted benevolence lay in tatters next to discarded baguettes. These twin catastrophes, endless fiscal failure and daily starvation, yanked whatever scant trust remained in the crown away. Across the realm, voices cried out for an Estates General, a grand assembly of clergy, nobility, and the third estate that's everyone else to take the reins of power. Even the Senate, that tax-exempt fortress, quivered at the notion on the 24th of January, 1789. Louis the 16th, cornered by this democratic monster he'd unleashed, inked the decree summoning delegates from every corner of France to Versailles. He promised grand solutions, but what he truly ignited was the fire of revolution. By late May 1789, Versailles had shed its frivolous veneer. Ambassadors in diplomatic finery and provincial envoys in modest suits flooded the palace gates, each clutching petitions thick as cookbooks. Merchant guilds hauled in ledgers of tariff grievances. Peasant representatives toted meticulously annotated accounts of tithes and corvée labour. Even junior clergy dared to demand parish reform. The marble halls, once serenaded by harps and whispers of court gossip, now thundered with fiery speeches, rippling debates, and the rustle of hundreds of scrolls. The scent of polished stone mingled with the electric hum of expectation, as if Versailles itself sensed its iron grip on power was about to be pried loose. Gone were the masked balls and moonlit dances. Instead of candlelit frivolity, courtiers found themselves elbowed aside by earnest provincials, brandishing pamphlets and petitions like battle standards. Days filled with committee sessions, fact-finding tours, and vocal outbursts of we and non replaced the gentle lilt of chamber music. Ruffled feathers and powdered wigs gave way to the messy, unglamorous business of democracy, where voices rose. Alliances forged and shattered in the span of an hour, and ministers dashed from one chamber to the next, patching holes in tax codes before public scrutiny sank their flimsy barricades. By the end of May 1789, the air in Versailles was stifling thick, with the collective breath of 1,000 delegates demanding change. The old absolutist court, so used to royal edicts, sealed with flourishes of quills and feathers, now faced an assembly insisting on transparency and accountability. This was no mere advisory council. It was the embryonic form of a government in the hands of the people. On his elevated rostrum, the once untouchable king peered down at a sea of eager faces whose loyalty would have to be earned, no longer a birthright. And so, in that heady moment, the gears of power irrevocably shifted. The Estates General did more than convene. It transformed Versailles into a crucible of democratic experiment. The path had been paved by the grotesque end of Louis the 15th and the kingdom's subsequent financial and moral bankruptcy. Now, as delegates hashed out tithes and restructured the state budget, it became clear that the age of absolute monarchy was drawing to a close. In its place rose the dawn of civic participation and the first tremors of revolutionary France, proving once and for all that power, when hoarded and unresponsive, crumbles beneath the will of the people. On the 5th of May in the year 1789, the Estates General finally mustered in Versailles' sumptuous Hall of Mirrors, 3 estates filing in through separate doors like unwilling contestants at a rigged game show. First came the noblesse, in their silver-threaded caps, then the clergy in velvet robes, and last the third estate brawny merchants, scravniloviers, and sun-baked peasants jostling in to represent every grumbling stomach in France. Custom held that each estate got 1 vote apiece. Turning democracy into a sick joke, 2 groups of privileged few could always outvote the many. Barely had the trumpets died down before the third estate's deputies, fed up with being overruled by their tax-exempt betters, demanded a fairer system. One delegate. One vote. If 200 commoners outnumbered 50 aristocrats, why shouldn't their say carry more weight? The air, thick with candle smoke and the musk of stiff wigs, crackled as noble countenances tightened into scowls and bishops fussed with their mitres. The Third Estate members shifted like caged beasts, ready to pounce on tyranny. By the 17th of June, impatience snapped the last thread of courtesy. Backed by a handful of sympathetic nobles and clerics, the Third Estate proclaimed itself the National Assembly, boldly claiming the right to speak for all of France. Palace guards blinked in disbelief, royal ministers gasped into their lace cuffs, and the once unshakable edifice of absolutism quivered at its core. When Louis the 16th refused to acknowledge this audacious coup, the rebel deputies found their chamber locked. Undeterred, they procured a key, some allege from the absent valet's pocket, and stormed a nearby tennis court, the Salle du Jeu de Paume. There, on the dusty wooden floor, they swore a solemn oath. They would not disband until France had a constitution worthy of its people. Thus emerged the legendary tennis court oath on the 20th of June, sealed not with wine, but with clenched jaws and steely resolve. Word of their defiance raced back to Paris faster than a tax collector fleeing a mob. The city erupted carpenters slung down their tools in solidarity. Shopkeepers banged shutters in approval, and constables struggled to keep order as street orators denounced tyranny from every corner. Radical clubs sprouted Jacobins, huddling in musty cellars. Girondins hashing strategy in flickering lamplight, each group vying to define the path forward. Pamphlets fluttered through the air like doves of hope, plastering walls and fueling chants to back the new assembly and tear down noble privilege. Back in Versailles, panic seized the court. Louis the 16th, torn between rewarding the daring rebels and quelling their insurrection, wavered like a man hugging a live grenade. Finally, on a damp July morning, he summoned both nobles and clergy to join the assembly in an act of reluctant concession. With cap in trembling hand, he seemed to admit that his royal monopoly on power was, in fact, négociable. This half-hearted olive branch barely earned a smirk from the Third Estate, and even that quickly turned to suspicion. They hadn't risked everything just for a ceremonial seat at the table. They demanded real authority. Yet Louis's recantation laid bare. The monarchy's dwindling grip no longer would royal edicts fall unquestioned. Now even a king had to parley with an elected body, and so began the awkward infancy of constitutional rule. Versailles' grand halls, once echoing with the rustle of silks and the trill of chamber music, now throbbed with the scratch of quills, the rustle of leaflets, and the murmur of fervent debate. Courtiers accustomed to ceremonies in perfumed antechambers found themselves shuttling through committees on taxation, land reform, and tithes, eyes darting nervously to the portraits of forebears who never imagined power being shared with tailors, clerks, or wheelwrights. By the time the National Assembly settled into its rhythm, Versailles had been transformed. Royal antechambers became committee rooms. Once, hallowed throne rooms turned into voting chambers, and every mirror reflected not regal grandeur but the determined faces of a people reclaiming their destiny. Louis the 16th sat at his elevated desk, flanked by jittery courtiers and uneasy bishops. No longer the divine pivot of the universe, but first among equals, in a national council. In those heady summer days of 1789, the old regime yielded inch by painful inch to a new order. Absolute monarchy gave way to the embryonic promise of constitutional governance, though the transition was messy, spiked with rancor, betrayal, and sporadic violence. No trumpet of Versailles could unring the tennis court oath. From that moment on, the die was cast. The age of divine right kings slipped through gilded fingers, replaced by government of the people, by the people, and for the people, Versailles was no longer a stage for decadent pageantry, but a crucible of democracy's birth. And as France and eventually much of Europe journeyed toward a new political dawn, the faint echo of that oath continued to resound. Never again would power remain unchecked or the people's voice silenced. Between July and October of 1789, France held elections for the new National Constituent Assembly, an awkward title, but at least it didn't say Monarchs Anonymous. Delegates flooded in from every hamlet and hive rowdy. Third Estate delegates alongside a handful of junior nobles who'd finally sniffed a whiff of true influence. The result was a motley crew so diverse that even Versailles' most rigid aristocrats squinted in disbelief. No sooner had they gathered than the real work began. First item, eviscerate feudal nonsense. Talk of equal taxes jumped off the drawing board. Freedom of worship graduated from whispered rumours to formal proposals, and press freedom vaulted from underground pamphlets into official minutes. Lawmakers scribbled with feverish gusto, ready to strip peasants free from manorial chains, as if cutting barnacles off a grand old ship. Then came the legendary night of August 4th, a session so dramatic it felt choreographed for history books. Under torchlight that flickered like a bad pun, the assembly voted to abolish every last feudal privilege. Nobles tore up their seigneurial dues. Manorial tolls evaporated. Clergy tithes were slashed. And the droit de chasse, those regal hunting rights, was kicked to the curb. Picture an aristocrat opening his post, only to find that every lavish tax break he'd ever relished had vanished with a single flourish of a pen. Across France, commoners woke to a new dawn. No more crushing feudal levies. Only the promise of the rule of law and social justice finally on the table. Riding that high, the assembly set its sights on a loftier prize, codifying human dignity itself. On August 26th, amidst a haze of rising incense and the rustle of starched cravats, they adopted the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen. Its grand opening thundered. Men are born and remain free and equal in rights. It promised to shield free expression from court censors, fortify property rights against capricious seizures, and enshrine the right to resist oppression. Far from idle platitudes, these articles became the North Star for every constitution that followed, spawning democratic charters from Stockholm to Seville. Back in Paris, the reaction was nothing short of euphoric. Market vendors hoisted the declaration aloft like prized baguettes. Cafe patrons spilled onto sidewalks, debating its clauses between sips of coffee, and popular songwriters swapped bawdy drinking songs for lofty anthems of liberté. Across Europe, droit de l'homme spread like wildfire in summer wind. Towns formed revolutionary communes, newfangled councils in cities and village assemblies in fields power, shifting from palace balconies to cobblestone public squares. As autumn leaves pirouetted down the Champ de Mars, authority slipped through royal fingers and into the grasp of elected representatives, guildmasters, carpenters, and even a clutch of erstwhile minor nobles, who'd learned democracy wasn't just for peasants. No longer did decrees tumble down from velvet-draped balconies. Now every major decision awaited the nod of citizens whose voices had been muffled for centuries. Thus, from July's spirited elections to August's midnight abolition of feudalism and August's landmark Declaration of Human Rights, France tore down its medieval scaffolding and erected the pillars of a constitutional order, Versailles' Hall of Mirrors. Once a stage for monarch's vanity, echoed instead with the scratch of quills and the rustle of pamphlets. Town halls and village moots animated fields that had long known only the hush of forced obeisance. In that gentle revolution, a sleepy yet seismic shift, fueled by idealism and peasant practicality, Europe witnessed the birth of modern citizenship. Power ceased to be a divine endowment and became instead a delicate treaty between rulers and the ruled, and though the path ahead would be rocky, pockmarked by betrayals and battles, the die had been cast. The age of kings by divine right was give way to the era of government by the people. For the people. And yes, occasionally against the people who forgot to vote. The dream of democracy, once a distant murmur, now chanted through every city gate and country lane, heralding a new political dawn whose light would never be fully extinguished. As autumn's chill crept over Paris barricades in 1789, the revolution's furnace only roared hotter. The Great Bread Crisis resurfaced with a vengeance. Wagons of stale grain vanished. Loaves cost more than a day's wage, and starving families eyed bakers as if they were hoarding treasure. Meanwhile, the king's army turned into a walking lament. Muskets rusted for want of powder, uniforms hung in tatters, and supply wagons arrived 2 weeks overdue, if at all. Many soldiers, touched by the cries of their own neighbours, slipped away in the night, or simply swapped blue cockades for tricolour ribbons and joined the citizens' ranks. Back in royal enclaves, tension between the people and their monarch hit fever pitch. The National Constituent Assembly laboured day and night to draft a constitution, a written promise to curb absolutism, while Louis the 16th procrastinated with the eagerness of a cat at bath time each time he set pen to paper. He fretted like a man deciding whether to eat a mystery stew. His delays sparked fresh muttering deputies, whispered of royal foot-dragging. Courtiers predicted chaos, and pamphleteers gleefully spread rumours of anarchy. The gulf between the king and his people yawned wider than the Seine. Then, on the 6th of October, the simmering crisis burst into flames. Parisian women, furious at skyrocketing bread, costs marched by the thousands to Versailles, armed with pikes, tambourines, and every unpaid tax receipt they could clutch. They stormed the palace gates chanting, "Bread or blood, guards," bewildered by the sudden onslaught, surrendered without firing a shot. Within hours, Louis the 16th and Marie Antoinette, roused abruptly from their gilded slumber, found themselves corralled into the Tuileries Palace in Paris, proper transformed overnight from a stately home into honourable detention. The court at Versailles evaporated in a swirl of powdered wigs and abandoned tiaras. In the weeks that followed, the Tuileries became the revolution's drawing room. The National Constituent Assembly decamped from Versailles' mirrored halls to the more modest Palais Bourbon and the Salle du Manège, which had fewer echoes of royal entitlement. Throughout Paris, a quasi-democratic republic sprouted like spring mushrooms. City, communes, organised local government. Citizens formed checkpoint militias, and public assemblies debated everything from street lighting to church bells. The gaudy pageantry of absolutism gave way to the scrappy hum of grassroots democracy. Amid this political maelstrom, two factions carved themselves out. The Girondins, cautious moderates from provincial towns, preached gradual reform and feared Parisian mobs more than royal edicts. Across the aisle, the Jacobins, fervent radicals in snug velvet jackets, demanded sweeping change and kept a watchful eye on any sign of royal treachery. Each camp professed revolutionary purity. Each eyed the other's motives with growing suspicion, and each marked their enemies' pamphlets with feverish endorsements of liberty. By late October, the Bourbon monarchy's absolute rule lay in tatters. Though Louis the 16th still bore the title King of the French, his royal authority had been siphoned off by elected deputies and citizen militias. Emboldened by August's Declaration of Rights and October's female-led palace takeover, the Assembly plunged into its greatest undertaking, drafting a constitution that would bind all, even a king, under law. They sketched out a three-branch government: legislative, executive, judicial. To ensure no single office could lord power unchecked, they proposed broad manhood suffrage, albeit weighed by property, and inscribed protections for free speech, religious tolerance, and private property safeguards against the very tyranny that had once paraded through Versailles' gilded gates. By the winter of 1790, draft after draft sat piled before the Assembly, like meticulously plotted pâtés waiting for a taste test. Debates crackled in firelit cafes. Would the king retain a veto power, or would he bow to popular will? Patrons raised mugs in toast to a future without secret memoranda or sealed royal orders. The kingdom's new scaffold, visible in every tender clause, promised to enshrine personal freedoms and crush the nightmare of unsigned charters, leaving citizens at sovereigns' mercies. Thus, in that season of revolt turned constitutional rebirth, a new France emerged, the ancient regime shattered under the crunch of baguettes and the scratch of quills. Where once a solitary monarch's whim had reigned supreme, power now radiated from a mosaic of elected representatives and vigilant citizen assemblies. The dream of divine right absolutism lay buried beneath the Tuileries' frozen steps, replaced by the enduring principle of government by consent. And though the road ahead brimmed with betrayals and battles yet to come, one chivalry, truth glowed clear in the lantern light. A nation once shackled to crown and church now sowed its destiny in the hand-to-hand crafting of democracy. One sleepier, bloodier barricade at a time. By tracing the arc from Versailles' glittering courts to the smoke-choked streets of revolutionary Paris, this video offers viewers more than a history lesson. It delivers a profound meditation on power, legitimacy, and civic responsibility. At its core, it reminds us that governments derive authority not from divine right or ancient custom, but from the consent of the governed. When that consent is repeatedly ignored through unfair taxation, empty bread racks, or unsigned constitutions, the very fabric of society unravels, and people will step into the streets to claim the rights long denied to them. Thus, this video's message resonates beyond 18th century France, serving as a timeless testament to the principle that rulers must remain accountable or risk being swept aside by the tide of popular will. Viewers can also glean practical lessons about the anatomy of reform. The National Constituent Assembly's methodical approach, first abolishing feudal privileges, then codifying individual rights, and finally drafting a constitution with checks and balances, illustrates the necessity of thoughtful, staged progress. Rapid change without planning can veer into chaos. While years of procrastination can provoke uprisings, the events of 14 July's storming of the Bastille through October's March of the Fishwives demonstrate that meaningful reform is neither top-down nor spontaneous. Rather, it requires mass participation, constant vigilance, and a balance between radical energy and institutional stability. Moreover, the video highlights the indispensable role of grassroots activism, whether in the form of pamphleteers circulating Enlightenment tracts, women barricading palace gates, or local communes enforcing the new laws. It shows that revolutions are not just shaped by prominent figures or dramatic moments, but by countless small acts of defiance and solidarity. From that vantage, the French Revolution's opening act becomes a call to viewers today. Never underestimate the power of ordinary citizens to bend the arc of history toward justice. In closing, this exploration of 1789 offers a twofold value. It enriches our understanding of a pivotal historical moment, illuminating the complex interplay of economic crisis, political maneuvering, and popular mobilization. Simultaneously, it delivers a stirring message for the present democracy, demands active engagement. Rights require vigilante defense, and lasting change demands courage from every quarter of society. As audiences watch the curtain fall on the old regime and rise on the new constitutional order, they are reminded that the spirit of the revolution lives on in every citizen's vow to hold power to account and to build a better world by the people, for the people, and with the people.